From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
What did Joe Manchin get in the bargain for Democrats' $430 billion spending bill? And is Nancy Pelosi likely to agree? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Alicia Finley. Hello and happy Friday to you both. Joe Manchin's agreement this week to a partisan reconciliation bill will cost Americans something on the order of $433 billion in spending and $327 billion in taxes. If you haven't listened to yesterday's podcast, I would recommend that. It goes through the big tax and spend items. But today, let's tackle what Manchin says he has gotten in return. And we'll start with a clip of him Thursday on Metro News, West Virginia.
Unless you're energy independent, you will not be a superpower in the world. If you're depending on other nations to produce your energy for you, you're not going to be able to maintain that superpower status. And we have the resources to do it. So until everyone came around and understood, I wasn't budging from making sure we have a robust energy portfolio and we'll have a robust investment portfolio, then it'd be balanced. You can walk and chew gum. It's a hard time getting people to even think that way because they were so aspirational. Get rid of all fossil, get rid of all coal, get rid of all oil, get rid of all gas, get rid of everything. Yeah, and we'll go to hell in a handbasket.
So that's what Manchin has been saying all along. And one of the things I think that he seems to have gotten in this bill is tying oil and gas leases from the federal government to solar and wind development. So there's a provision that would allow onshore wind and solar rights from federal land only if the Interior Department had also held lease sales for onshore oil and gas in the previous 4 months. Kim, do you have a sense of how big a deal this would be for the fossil fuel industry?
Well, it's certainly a step forward, at least under this administration, which has not only scrapped a number of leases, but its most recent 5-year development plan, which it hasn't decided on the final contours of yet, but held out the possibility of offering 0 leases in the upcoming timeframe. There's also a provision in here, too. You mentioned the onshore portion of it. The bill would require to hold some leases that had already been planned in the Gulf of Mexico and in Alaska's Cook Inlet. Back in May, the Interior Department had scrapped 3 of those, and so those would have to go forward. But there's also an ongoing offshore provision in this as well, too, saying that if the administration wants, for instance, to do offshore renewable leases, say for wind, that they can only do that if there had been oil and gas leases spanning at least 60 million acres done in the prior year. So what is interesting to me about this is not just the tying of these two together, but what it could mean for litigation as well, too, in that left-wing activists and green groups have increasingly been suing to stop all of these offshore and onshore fossil fuel developments. If it looks as though by doing so they could hold hostage renewable development, that might change the calculation. That is probably why you have seen a furious response from the left as they have come to understand more of this deal and these provisions in particular. They're very unhappy about it. Now, I mean, maybe there's still some potential for them to sue after renewable leases have gone in effect, but I think it certainly makes it a little bit harder.
The other piece that Manchin is pointing to that he has gotten in this deal, and I'll read a piece of his statement. He says, President Biden, Leader Schumer, and Speaker Pelosi have committed to advancing a suite of common sense permitting reforms this fall that will ensure all energy infrastructure, from transmission to pipelines and export facilities, can be efficiently and responsibly built to deliver energy safely around the country and to our allies, unquote. And Alicia, I think permitting reform would be a big deal if he can get it. But there's no details that have been provided here. And I'm curious what kind of permitting reform exists that Joe Manchin and Nancy Pelosi and President Biden can all agree on.
Well, I don't think one does exist. Just going back to Kim's point about the litigation, this is really the big issue. It's not so much the law itself. It's the litigation that really holds up. I mean, yes, permitting can take a few years, but it's the litigation, the legal challenges, the opportunities for legal challenges under NEPA, but as well as some other laws, NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, as well as some other laws that provide opponents of these projects. And they're not just green groups, by the way. There are a lot of, NIMBY activists who don't want even wind power or transmission lines connecting wind power to population centers. How a reform deals with the litigation aspect is going to be key. And going just back to Kim's point about the suing to block the leases, there are already two laws that require the administration to hold quarterly leases in terms of onshore development. The administration has basically just snubbed Congress that has refused to follow the law. So there are questions whether Congress can require the administration to do all sorts of things, and they can put all kinds of things in law. But if the administration doesn't follow them, what good does it do? I mean, you could still go to court to try to enforce it, as the oil and gas companies, and actually I think some of the GOP states have done, but there's nothing to actually force the administration's hand, maybe a contempt citation. But what we saw with the last June, a federal judge ordered the Interior Department to hold onshore leases as required by law. It's basically dithered for over a year. It said, oh, we're just, doing some more environmental analysis. So I'm very skeptical of any kind of legislation, even if it were to pass, to actually force the administration's hands or do something that it doesn't want to do.
Alicia brings up the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, often called NEPA. And I agree that that is a big part of the issue here. The Trump administration did some reforms to NEPA and put out some data. And according to them, from 2013 to 2017, the average environmental impact statement took 4 years and 669 pages. But there were also some pretty wild outliers in that data. There was a contentious 12-mile expansion of an interstate around Denver, and it took 13 years to get through the environmental review process and almost 9,000 pages. And I can guarantee you that nobody read all those 9,000 pages. So that's the kind of sclerosis that we're talking about here. And Kim, on the energy side, there have been 2 pipelines in recent years that won cases at the Supreme Court, and then they were canceled anyway by their developers. And some of that maybe has to do with changing business facts on the ground, but also it's just the gauntlet that you have to run to get anything actually built is a problem. Manchin brings up the export terminals. It would be great if we could send some American energy to our allies in Europe and break Vladimir Putin's leverage there, but also just to communities in the Northeast that need natural gas and elsewhere.
Oh, absolutely. And, to put those examples in context, the Hoover Dam, which is obviously this stunning testimony to American ingenuity and ability to do big projects, Congress authorized it in 1928. Construction started in 1931. The whole thing was done and dusted and opened by 1936. Now, that's how you get something done. And it has become impossible to do such things under these environmental rules. NEPA, by the way, is older than I am, and it's never been reformed really in its entire existence, at least not by its creators, Congress. Now, you mentioned that the Trump team had tried to, from a regulatory perspective, engage in some reforms, and they were quite good as they go in that they put limits on those environmental impact statements for bigger projects. They said they couldn't take more than 2 years or run to more than 300 pages. For smaller projects, 1 year and 75 pages. They tightened up the definition a little bit of what actually counted as federal involvement, thereby potentially getting some projects off the hook for these long and laborious process. And then they changed some definitions. One thing that environmentalists love to use when they bring these lawsuits is this provision saying that environmental impact statements have to measure the cumulative impact of a project. And they can quibble over this in court for years because, when they want to look at a cumulative impact, they want to know if a project is going to cause sea levels to rise on the other side of the world 100 years from now. And so that's one of the reasons these things take so long. Now, the Biden administration, unfortunately, is moving to roll back all of those reforms, which I think is worth pointing out, because how is an administration that is so aggressive about undoing the most common sense reforms that existed actually going to be a valid partner, to Alicia's point, in some sort of permitting reform with Joe Manchin? Because essentially what the Trump administration did is what would need to be in the middle of any permitting reform deal with Joe Manchin. You would think that the first step that the White House would take to be to simply call off their decision to get rid of those Trump reforms.